Tomorrow, Anansi is going to be performing in Kalele, the first music tech symposium in East Africa. And as a part of our takeover of the base camp, we're going to be having a teleperformance. And for this teleperformance, we're going to have people on site at the base camp in person. We're going to have people spread out through Nairobi, some folks in Kalifi, and one of our members is going to also be in Shanghai, and we will all be performing together. And so the way that we've done this is through a combination of a bunch of different technologies, namely using, our normal DAW. So here we're using Ableton. We're using some techniques called tele-MIDI, which use a few different software that come together to make this possible. Here on PC, I'm using a program called Zero Tier, which sort of like spoofs your IP similar to a VPN in order to make it so that uh, all of the computers look like they're on the same network, and another program called RTP MIDI, which is only necessary if you're using a PC. It's similar to just like the Bonjour MIDI setup program on Apple. And so we're also using another program called SonoBus that allows for low latency audio transfer. So if on one hand we have tele-MIDI that is sending MIDI data directly, which is really helps with like getting the latency down. SonoBus is more for if you're trying to send vocals or the sound of an instrument directly without necessarily using MIDI. And so with this setup, the whole idea is I wanted to create an Ableton Live patch, or sorry, an Ableton Live set that is standard and that I can send to all of the people that are participating so that it's a lot easier for us to get our DAWs in sync for the performance. And so what we can see here is I've tried to organize this as cleanly as possible. And we have, the people who are going to be performing from the base camp, Ndugu and Unjust, Justin, and we will also have Undieki over there taking care of the tech setup and also like helping with some mixing and mastering for the people that are there in person. Then we have Nairobi. I will be performing from my house, the Anansi residential compound, and Nabulayo will be performing from her home, further out, Pasarangai. And then in Kalifi, we have Sultan and Jabez. Sultan's going to be doing some beat stuff, while Jabez will be helping out with the tech setup. And then in Shanghai, we have Narja. And then here on the far left, what we have is this group for default. And so if we look at the default, what we're seeing is the setup for people who are sending MIDI out from their computer, right? So in order to demonstrate like why this is necessary, let's take a look at the Shanghai group with Narja, right? With Narja, because all we need is to have his MIDI data come into the computer, uh, and then control some sort of synth, right? Or some sort of instrument. All we need is the one track because it's just essentially treating the telemidi, telemidi bus like another MIDI controller, any other MIDI controller that's sending on one channel, on channel 5, right? And then we have the monitor set to in so that it knows, okay, we should be monitoring this thing all the time. But if we're trying to send out from our computer, it's a little bit more complicated because if we were to say, add a synth onto this track where we're getting the information from our MIDI controller, or in my case, my computer keyboard, what it does is it bumps off and makes it so that the audio is being sent to some channel instead of the MIDI. And we want for MIDI to send out because we need for that MIDI to send out over telemidi. And so what I've done here is I've set up a group, right, where I have the MIDI controller, right? This is where the MIDI data is coming from, our controller, our computer keyboard, maybe some other VST or some other controller on our computer. And then it says to send MIDI to, and I'm sending it to, in my case, what I've named tele-MIDI bus. And so tele-MIDI bus is the name that I gave uh, my, let's say, MIDI bus in RTP MIDI so that this is what my computer is seeing when I am trying to connect. So what it's saying is the same way that if I was to be using like loop MIDI or some other virtual MIDI bus, it shows up here as tele-MIDI bus inside of my computer. And then when I go into Ableton under preferences, under let's see, under MIDI, in my MIDI ports, it shows up under the name that I've named it, right? Tele-MIDI bus, tele-MIDI bus. Cool. And so now it should send out on that way. But then also I have this other track here called MIDI sound. And what it does is it's pulling the MIDI from this track from MIDI controller. And so now this is responsible for actually picking up the MIDI data and also sending out the MIDI data. And then this is responsible for creating the sound. And so now I set this to computer keyboard and I click my computer keyboard. I can hear the sound coming out from here. And you can see this isn't actually a sound, right? This is just MIDI data that's going out and also being heard over here. Cool. So one last thing to note before I get into how to switch this over for people who are performing. Um, you'll notice that in all of the different tracks that we have, none of them are receiving from channel one, right? Here, here, here. So we start with channel two, right? And the reason for that is because the computer keyboard can only send onto channel one. And so if somebody needs to use their computer keyboard in order to test, or that's what they're going to be using to send, we can't have like something on both because then it will trip up the program and it could be like doubling back if you say to somebody or to say to the computer, okay, this person, it's coming from channel one. If I'm using my computer keyboard and it's also coming into channel one, it's also going to be playing, like if we have all in set here, it's going to be playing on both. So that's why we start with channel two. Okay. So the last piece here is just like, how do I make this work for me as the person who is performing, right? And so what you'd want to do is set your MIDI controller here to whatever settings you're going to be using, right? Maybe I have another program that I'm using. Like I like to use Sonic Pi, which uses another, like a different virtual MIDI bus, but for this presentation, I'll set it to computer keyboard. And then I know from here, okay, I'm supposed to be sending on channel three. So I'm going to set my MIDI 2 to channel 3. And then over here, I'm going to set my MIDI from to, let's see, MIDI controller, right? And I don't really need this, but for now, I'll just unenable it so that I'm not going to be hearing it. Actually, let me just turn it off completely so that yeah, disable it. Uh, and so then now, when I do this, the MIDI controller is going to be sending over to here. And so I'll still hear it over on this side as well as uh, see it coming in on this side. And then now, Nairobi, it's coming in. The sound is coming over here, right? And then so that's it for the tele-MIDI setup. For SonoBus, things are a little bit different, right? And so basically, when I am working with SonoBus, what I do is, let's say I'm unjust Justin, right? And so I'm going to be sending out from my computer, uh, um, and I'm also going to be receiving stuff from other people at the same time. And so let's say here I'm going to connect to my normal private group, in this case ARC000, and in this case I am cosplaying as Justin, so I'll change my display name to Unjust. Then I'm going to click connect to group. Because I want for mine to go out, and I don't want to hear any of the stuff that's being received from another person, what I want to do is set this to solo. So then that way, as anybody else that joins the group comes in, uh, I'll never hear them coming through on this particular track, right? And then next, what I'll do is close this up, and I'm going to pretend now to be Nabalayo. And so I'm still unjust, right? But Nabalayo is going to be joining into this session. And so here, this is kind of like an input. So I'm saying the same, I'm joining the same group, but I want this to be Nabalayo in, or I'll just say unjust in. And I know that this is me receiving, right? And I want to, in this case, I'm going to definitely mute this. And then, because I don't want to hear what's coming in from the output of my other uh, track, but I'm now joining this SonoBus session from my phone, and this one I'll name Nabalayo. Hello, hello. And then now we can see and even hear this coming in from my phone as Nabalayo. And so what I would do is click solo so that now whenever somebody else joins the track, uh, it will still only be Nabalayo's voice coming in on this particular line, right? Yeah, and so that's the whole thing with the SonoBus stuff. As you're connecting, you want to make sure that you're soloing on all of the different pieces, on all of the different SonoBus pieces. So then that way we're able to make sure that even as people are joining and as people are leaving, it's not doubling up the audio and giving you like weird distortions. Cool. And so that's what our teleperformance setup is going to be looking like for Kalele. I hope that this is helpful both for you guys that are performing tomorrow and anybody else that is interested in these teleperformance techniques that we are trying out.